very excited today to introduce Brenda Bushouse to our weekly colloquium. Brenda did her PhD at IU, so she's back home, because she's going to be a visiting scholar for this semester here at the Ostrom Workshop. She's Associate Professor of Public Policy at University of Massachusetts Amherst, and her research addresses nonprofit governance, institutional analysis, and child policy. Brenda is now working on a book manuscript I can't wait to read on the role of foundations and philanthropies in social movements and policy advocacy for children in the US. And her presentation today is based on her co-authored paper that is entitled Understanding Our Philanthropic Commons. The title changed just a bit. Thank you so much, Brenda, and please join me in welcoming her.
Hi, it's nice to be here. My co-authors, Rob is flying over the Pacific right now to South Korea. And Brent threw his back out yesterday.
Oh, no.
And I got exposed to COVID, but I have tested negative consistently and been away. So anyways, I'm masked and the windows are open and an abundance of caution. So kind of almost like 3 strikes, but this project is been in the works for a couple of years now, and we have a forthcoming book with, well, can we say forthcoming? I mean, all the chapters are in draft. It's with Cambridge University Press, and what we're doing is trying to establish the Philanthropy Commons as a new area of common scholarship. So what I'm going to do today is talk about it. And the picture that we have on our first slide is of Aspen Grove in Utah. And we held a retreat where we invited philanthropy scholars. And then we had 3 workshoppers. We had Adela Schlager and Bill Blomquist, who's also a contributing author, and Charlie Schweik there. And we did it workshop style where somebody else presented the other's paper. And then there were discussants. And so it was a really rich discussion. And so from those discussions came this book. So we are really excited to present. Even here they are. Here's my colleagues. Oops, can we minimize maybe that? There we go. Rob is at Brigham Young University, and Aspen Grove is the BYU retreat. And it's gorgeous. And then Brent Nevers and the Block School at University of Missouri, Kansas City. And so we have been having the most delightful conversations for all of our careers, basically, because we meet up annually at this conference for nonprofit scholars called our NOVA. Terrible acronym, but it's the Association for Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action. So, but we meet up, and there's usually an Indiana University alumni table, and we go out for dinner and we all catch up. So this book came from those conversations. Let's see if I can get this to it. There we go. These were our motivations. Okay, we felt fatigued from the relentless request to give. You know, we all had children, so you're getting them from their schools and their sports and their performing arts and, everything. And then we live near the campus, so everybody knocks on our door with every single cause imaginative. And then you get the online appeals through social media, or you go to GoFundMe, or, then you get the mail. And then you get, the causes that you really are passionate about that you give to every year. And then you get asked to volunteer for chair this committee, be on this board, sit, do this, do that. And we were feeling really exhausted by it. And so we started calling it donor fatigue, because we felt very fatigued. And we figured that where we were in our careers was like a target range for appeals at professor range, like, oh, okay, yeah, we want them. Okay, so, but then we looked at some stats. When we first started talking about this, giving was in decline. But then during the pandemic, it popped back up again. And I'll show some slides in just a minute. But the number of households is decreasing. The number of households that give in 2002 was about 68%, and now it's below 50%. Okay, so the number of households is declining. So here's some data just in terms of what's happening with giving. And this is from the Giving USA right up here in Indianapolis. My Lilly School colleagues, I had hoped they would be here, but they have a job candidate right now. So there's a lot of really amazing scholars that study philanthropy. And so the Giving Institute, or Giving USA puts this out. They put out a study every year. And what you see on the top gold is this decrease, I'll just stand up. Decrease in religious giving right across the top, 58% in the 5-year increase starting in 1982 down to 32. And I got that again. Or can you block that? Or on my screen, it's full.
There we go.
Okay. And if you see what's happening, yeah, you know, down here in terms of, if we see these smaller amounts, which ones are getting bigger, which ones are declining. So this lightest one, the foundations, you see an increase in giving to foundations. I just wanted to highlight that because we're going to come back to it. Okay, so giving by individuals and foundations, you'll see an inflation adjusted dollars are both going up. Individual giving is like over 3 times what foundation giving is, but they're both going up. So what does this mean? So I wanted to include this slide because the darker blue is private foundations. The lighter blue are what's called donor advised funds. So donor advised funds really are a giving institutional arrangement that's really only been building since 2007. You see where it started. And now, if you look at this, here's just some data on comparing the amount of money. So the amount of money in assets for private foundations is much larger. Foundations have to give out 5% of their assets every year. Okay, a minimum, but they can include administrative costs and these types of things, but they have to give that away. And I'm using this as an example of a framing of a social dilemma. There are many, but here's one. Okay, and then if you look at these logos, what do you notice? What do you notice in these logos? These are the top 6.
One of them's here.
Oh wait, this isn't a top 6. I just put it in. I put it in for fun. I put it in for fun.
Well, the for-profit, for sure.
Yeah, you've got Fidelity Charitable,
Yeah.
largest, and
Goldman
Goldman Sachs and Charity Vest. These have all created these charitable arms where they're marketing donor advised funds. And they're a way in which you can put a chunk of money away and you get immediate tax benefits. But then you can also take your donor advised fund and put it in with a community foundation. And community foundations are geographically focused. You know, so you have one for Monroe County. I put Greatest Kansas City Community Foundation because that's where Brent's from, but also it's really big. So you have these 2 choices, investment firms and then community foundations, but then one of the top ones is the National Christian Foundation. So that foundation, they are helping Christians invest their money. That's their whole reason for being. And so they have donor advised funds. So with donor advised funds, you give the money to an organization and you say, oh, I care about the arts, I care about education. Would you invest it for me? And it's actually those entities that decide how to invest it. Okay, so it's, you get the warm glow from writing the check or transferring the money, but they actually decide which charities get the funds, where they're going to invest it. And you can choose not to pay it out. You can just sit on it if you want. You know, those same rules don't apply in a lot of the ways. You can take it out and pay the tax penalties. It's much more flexible than a foundation. With a foundation, when you establish it, you have an endowment, then you have a board of directors, and then you're gonna, and small private family foundations, it's usually just the family on the board and they're making all the decisions, but then you get to the bigger foundations that we all know about. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Koch brothers, you know, those types of foundations that have very specific giving programs, and they have bigger boards. So there's more restrictions on the foundations than there are on donor advised funds. And so that's why you're seeing this real bump in these donor advised funds. So we have a chapter in the book by Dan Heist, who's really the most influential scholar right now on donor advised funds. He's just got his finger on the pulse, let's say. We also have Viviana Wu, who studies community foundations, and she's looking at when you have donors put their donor advised funds through your community foundation, they can restrict what you can do with the money. And so there's challenges that she's finding out between the restricted assets and what they can do with them and the ability of the community foundations to play a leadership role. So there's a lot of research going on right now in terms of restricted gifts and what they mean for the mission of the organization. Okay. So this is just one social dilemma here. Motivations and questions. What does more giving by the wealthy and less household participation mean for civil society? Because our conversations really started with decline in trust, decline in trust in government institutions, concerns about declines in social capital. These types of ideas were what we were thinking about. So here's another Utah photo. But we said, hey, Brent and I both had Lynn as dissertation chair, and Rob sat in on the workshop courses. So we said, hey, let's do a new lens. There seem to be social dilemmas going on here, lots of them. And how can we leverage our understanding of the commons to advance our understanding of philanthropy? So these were for people online that might not be as aware of these definitions. For us, they're old news, but commons, I'll just put them up there. And just remind people what a social dilemma is, because you know, they can happen with all different types of goods. We can have free riding for public goods. We can have depletion of common CPRs, over exclusion. My dissertation was on toll goods, over exclusion and congestion for toll goods, club goods. And we can also have information asymmetry for private goods, where we just don't know the quality of what we're getting. Okay, so there were some scholars before us that pointed this out. They are experts in volunteering, and the late Jeff Brettney and Lucas Mays identified volunteers are like natural resources. So they published an article focused on making that argument that they're depletable, and we should govern volunteers as a CPR. And then they used the design principles in another article. And more recently, Feline van Overbeek, Lucas's doctoral student who just defended, they expanded it to be focusing on sustaining volunteer energy. And I love this diagram. They've changed it now, but Lucas said I could use it. So in volunteer management, it tends to be in the blue circle, or you're thinking this is the organization that's recruiting the volunteer, and you're going to bring them in, and you're going to have some kind of human resource management process. Usually there's a volunteer administrator, or it's by program, but there's going to be some kind of human resource management. And a lot of what doesn't happen is offboarding. So when they're finished with their work for the organization, have they had a good experience, so that they'll either cycle back into the organization, or they'll come over here and they're using harvesting, reharvested, so that they come back and they stay in here. And so this commons is the willingness of people to volunteer their time. In my work on open source software, with some colleagues that are way smarter than I am, we've developed a way to measure energy of volunteers in terms of the code that they contribute to open source software. And that's with Curtis Atkinson. He might be on the call. But we're really interested in this part. How do we sustain it? You know, if we treat them like private goods, we can just get more volunteers. They're expendable. We can just, it's just a transaction. That's one way to think about it. But if we want to sustain this volunteer energy, then we better think about this. So I started, Rob, Brent and I started having conversations with Lucas and Feline, and now we're trying to, with Curtis Atkinson right now, we're trying to measure whether or not taking a sabbatical as a volunteer is a good strategy for sustaining your energy. So that's with Curtis Atkinson and Lucas and Feline. Yeah, so we're. I think everybody should get a sabbatical. I think we all need them. Yeah, so what I kind of wanted to do with this time, talk about what we're doing in the book. And I had a great exchange with Mike McGinnis over the weekend, and he gave me all kinds of things to think about, as he always had since I was a grad student. So we have 4 chapters on volunteering in the book. So Lucas Mays and colleagues are looking at they're using more of the IAD framework in their work on the volunteer commons. Jessica Word is looking at sustainability, and she's concerned particularly about declining trust. So she's looking at the outcomes and how the outcomes can actually build social capital. And Sue Carter-Call is a practitioner, and she's looking at corporate volunteering. So there's a situation in which the corporation says, hey, volunteers or employees, you can have a day off to go volunteer for this event. So they get the time off, but they get to the event and they may not really care about the charity that they're volunteering for. They're just getting a day off work, they're happy. And so it can create a burden on those nonprofit organizations because those volunteers may not be doing what they're supposed to do, or they may not do it in a very high quality way. So she's looking at that. And then Lena Ochoa is looking at volunteer energy as well, but looking at it from depletion and the design principles. Okay, so these are all philanthropy scholars, or these are scholars of volunteering. And except for Lucas, none of them were aware of workshop tools. So this has been a big intellectual kind of stretch for our co-authors or our contributing authors. So today I'm focusing on the philanthropic giving of money, because we're looking at this for the money part. So we say the willingness to give creates the commons. We may not have much money or time to give, but we might be willing to give, right? So maybe we can only give $1 or whatever, but we're willing to give. So that's the commons. And there are a bunch of philanthropic institutions. So some you may be really aware of: foundations, the community foundations. United Way is a federated funder where you tend to have workplace giving. And the whole idea behind United Way is that businesses were getting sick of being asked for money all the time. And so they created a way of screening the charities. And if they met these criteria, then they could be included in the giving for that year. And there would be a block of time when you would be giving to the United Way. And those charities that were accepted were not supposed to simultaneously be asking for money. So there are blackout dates for those charities. And then declines, Lori Parlberg especially has been researching this. She's up at IU Lilly School. But there's been declines in giving to United Way. And so one of the things I did was I said, okay, you can choose from your list of charities now, instead of just giving to the United Way, and the United Way would decide, which organization charities. So now you have some charities that get more than others. And that, again, that can create some winners and loser effects that maybe if the United Way were making all the choices about where the money was going to go, they may say, we'd like it to go in these allocations. Okay. So the power of the giver is an important thing to pay attention in this, and the way that they're exerting it. And that comes out with impact investing nonprofits. This is Emily Barman is writing this chapter, and it's really fascinating. So it's a scenario in which individuals invest in a certain outcome. The nonprofit is going to have some kind of outcome. And they're meaning for that outcome to happen. So it's very outcome driven, which sometimes with the mission of the organization's outcomes out of your control. Sometimes, there's a lot of other things that can happen. But this is the whole idea, is that you're an investor in the nonprofit. And then we talked about donor advised funds. Giving circles are the closest to the self-governing. Is anybody involved in a giving circle? Angie Eikenberry has been researching this, and it's they come in a lot of different ways, but you get together with some people and you pool some money and you decide which charities to donate to.
I've just been invited to one. I haven't been to the first meeting yet, but it's a group of women in Bloomington. Like Women Who Give or something like that is the name of it. So I'm curious. I've never participated in one.
You'll have to report back.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of different structures for them, but they're kind of the closest you could get to like really self-governing communities. And then faith institutions, of course, all different denominations. And then, these online funds, GoFundMe, there's no screening. If you give to something and it's fraudulent, you just lost your money. There's nobody that's GoFundMe is not taking any responsibility for the legitimacy of these calls for money, and they take 15%. So there's lots of different giving, institutional arrangements for giving. So we say willingness to give is a pro-social behavior. We make an assumption that giving is good. Okay, and that's an important one, because the first time I presented this idea, I got trounced by somebody, Jennifer Mosley from University of Chicago, who's actually one of my prior co-authors. She trounced me as only a former co-author can, but she said, what if I don't want any more philanthropy? What if I want the government to expand the services that it provides? So we are being very explicit in the book and in our project that there is an assumption that the willingness to give is good, because it's a pro-social behavior. It has all these other good things that happen when you have people who are willing to give their time or money. We're not going into the point about what is actually done with money, because sometimes it can create public bads, instead of public good. So we'll put that one on a shelf, but we're assuming that the willingness to give is actually a good thing. So why might it decline? We wrote up a paper on donor fatigue. Becker's in our book, Renee Becker's a Dutch scholar, has connected social values with pro-social behaviors. And so we want to, how do we rebuild the social values that it's good to help our neighbors, it's good to help others in need. And then declining social capital with Nickel and Eikenberry. You'll see it in the news, the loss of legitimacy. And whenever that happens, like the National Rifle Association right now, they have the misuse by Pierre. Yeah, they tried to move to Texas, but they can't get out of New York State. So yeah, they're in trouble for misusing funds. But whenever that happens, it's not just the NRA that finds loss of legitimacy. It challenges people's trust in charitable causes. And then, of course, the Catholic Church, the sexual abuse cases have really led to declines in their membership and also declines in giving. Okay, so when the Philanthropy Commons declines, what does that mean for the money resource? And that's why, I tend to think of money as a private good. So it's subtractable. You only have so many dollars in your wallet, and it's excludable. You can't get to my wallet if I don't want you to. So we have property rights over our money, and we must have a transaction in order for you to get my money. So using this lens, we might think of a decrease as something like, oh, I have less money to give. I want to go buy my, what would you like to buy? I don't know. Right now, I want a new Prius. I want a new Prius because the other car died. But so I might make a preference that I want to buy my Prius instead of giving you some money. Okay, but we said What if we think of it as a CPR? Okay, what does it mean if we do that? So could we think of money as subtractable and yet difficult to exclude oneself from being asked? So that action situation of being asked to give. And that's harder to do because as I started this talk, there's lots of different ways that we get asked for our money donations, and we can say no, but we still get asked. And so part of like donor advised funds might be people saying, okay, I'm going to put all my charitable contributions in this donor advised funds, and then I'm just going to ignore every other request, you know, and that's one way to do it. But you're still going to get asked. So we thought, okay, if we can think of monetary gifts as a CPR, okay, the relevant social dilemma is how to subtract without depleting it. Okay, so we see this, a resource scarcity is a provision problem. So there's a greater incentive to increase extraction. And we have met the fundraising schools up at Indianapolis at the Lilly School. There's fundraising school. There's lots of trainings on how to be an excellent fundraiser. And a lot of people have made very satisfying careers out of doing this, right? But that's an appropriation, right? If they get that donation. And then the question is, does it lead to resource depletion in which not only are the dollars gone, but then somebody's so sick of it, they just leave the giving commons. And so, and I just wanted to give a shout out to Bill Bloomquist because he was at Utah and his paper with Jen Shaker is looking at provision appropriation problems in higher ed giving. Okay, so I talked a bit about the chapters in this book. I guess part of me, I guess I'll go through the chapters and then I'd like to just throw it open for discussion, and that's almost a half an hour anyway, so it's about time. So some of these I've mentioned, I sorted them by topic, but what you'll see is that we've got people using the SES, people using the IAD, different parts of the IAD. We've got Angie doing the giving circle, so that's the most like a self-governing arrangement. And then we also have all the way up to, you know, community foundations. We have David Suarez doing foundations, and he's looking at loss of legitimacy because the people with the money are way up here and the people, the beneficiaries are way here. Okay, and where's the connection there? And so he's looking at participatory grant making by foundations. We have two people that are using the institutional grammar. And Dan Heist is using it to look at donor advised funds because there's different types of donor advised funds. And Eva is looking at the robber barons and kind of the norms of philanthropy that were happening in the turn of the 20th century and how high net worth donors, those norms are changing. Okay, so we have two people using the institutional grammar and then others looking at design principles. And Lori Parlberg and Eleanor Brilliant are looking at the United Way over time. Okay, so we've got an array. So these chapters are all in draft, and one of my main tasks for me while I'm here is to finish editing all those chapters with Rob and Brent, and we also have the 3 introductory chapters that we're writing. So this is our goal. We want to develop a shared language, and we think that using Bloomington School language will help us do that because there's a lot of people studying philanthropy, and they all study it. They're multidisciplinary. They study different parts of it, and we don't always have a common language. Okay, we want to do a systematic analysis of the social dilemmas. And what I'd like to do is chart those out. And I think in Mike's email, Mike McGinnis says he was charting out several of these. We're mainly looking in the book in terms of the institutional arrangements and their impacts on the action situation of being asked to give. That's just one kind, right? So we want to chart out the different types. We're using IED, SES, but many different disciplines and many different theories. And that's the one thing I've always loved about the workshop frameworks is that you can bring, a diversity of theories to bear and utilize these workshops. And we want to engage in comparative research. We have 2 Dutch scholars who contributed and the rest of us are US folks studying US. Oh, wait, Lena's from Colombia, I'm sorry. So we want to do comparative research from this perspective. And we approach this with humility because the philanthropy scholars have been working on this for years and we're kind of interlopers into this domain, but we're really excited about it. We're really excited about it. And I think the excitement has grown given the call for papers and the number of chapters in our book. I have to say this last picture of running, every time Rob and Brent get together, they go running. So I actually thought maybe this was Brent, but I don't think it is. Anyways, but we would love to have more. It's also symbolic because this is like me, Rob and Brent, and we want more people running with us and establishing the Philanthropy Commons. Okay.
Thank you, Brenda. See that we have a lot of questions on the chat. But let's.
So Brent threw out his back, but he was gonna try to be here. Oh, he's here. He's here.
He's online, I think.
Yeah, he's here. So Brent, I hope I didn't disappoint you.
Good job, Brenda. Thank you.
I don't know, Brenda, if you want to open the chat. I think there are many questions there, but maybe we. Yeah.
I have just a quick
We
clarification.
usually start with a graduate student.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. I just wanted to see if any
Oh, I'm
grad
sorry.
student was there. No, don't worry. I just wanted to see if maybe we have grad students here. But and some of them seemed more like comments than questions.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get a sense, but yes, let's open the room for
I
questions.
just have a clarification question. The book is on just the fundraising aspect, not the volunteer match kind of. Or-
No, there's 4 chapters on volunteering.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 4 chapters on volunteering.
But your paper today.
The paper today was just focusing because it was,
That's all I just
I
wanted.
thought it was too much to do both in one presentation.
I have a question. It's actually the first one in the chat. I typed it in there. And I'm wondering whether donor fatigue, as donors go down, contributions go down, corresponds in any way with the rise in subscriptions to everything, which is a pressure that all of us feel every time that we turn on the TV and no longer watch cable or public television and everything else. There's so much demand for subscription. And the subscription business talks about people reaching peak subscription, except the sum of subscriptions just keeps going up. So there's an entire economy around that. So I'm just wondering whether it seems to be, it would make sense that would dent people's willingness or ability as they're just sort of budgeting their lives to give. It's like, which is I'm already giving, public TV used to be free. Now you can't get it.
You have to get a passport.
Go to your local.
Yeah. And I think that the thinking about pro-social behaviors, and in terms of what those are and how they contribute to civil society is really important to think about. I think in a model of an individual, I think we could do some interesting studies to see, and maybe there are some, and my colleagues in philanthropy can speak to this potentially, in terms of the displacement effect of giving to subscriptions and giving to charities. Yeah, possibly. Do you do this?
Sure, if you want
No,
to,
you do it.
okay. I wanted to make sure that no grad students have questions. Okay. You seem to be good. Okay. So we have Jess. Stop.
This is actually a two-finger for a broader question about on Charles's point, which is about thinking about external constraints more broadly. So it seems to me that the goal of the book and in part the paper is to think about how institutions moderate this common pool problem, which I agree with you. I think this is a really an area, not, and I should, acknowledge this is also not my area. So, but it does seem an area ripe for thinking about it through these frameworks. So I'm really excited that you're doing this, but I'm curious, if or how either in the book or more broadly, you plan to either think about, address the broad range of kinds of external constraints that will be relevant here. So not only the other things that people are regularly now sort of opting into allocating resources towards, but also things like sort of how we think about the range or type and urgency of causes that are now available across the board, a general hopelessness associated with the media that might translate over to complete unwillingness or lack of belief in one's own capacity to participate and what the consequences might be, or even just choosing among the wide range of things, whether it's a GoFundMe for a student or Palestinian children, right? This is constant. I'm sure that there's a lot of this in the philanthropy work, but I'm just curious if or how you were thinking about addressing all of the wide range of external constraints, including range of causes, urgency of causes, like things that are actually not necessarily causes, but we've worked into our sort of regular financial commitments that might shape the effects of these institutions on this sort of common pool.
Yeah, so I've seen several philanthropy scholars on Zoom, and I would say we will be bringing in literature to inform. I don't know, and maybe someone can correct me, I don't know literature on like subscriptions. There's definitely the declines in bridging and bonding social capital, and kind of the decrease in social values. So there's literature that we can draw on. And I don't know if any of my colleagues want to say something more to that. You're welcome to. Oh, I see David's on there too. Nice to see you all. Or Brent, do you want to add to that one?
Sure. Can I just jump in real quick and say one important distinction that Emily Barman has written about is this increase in the scope of philanthropy beyond a local region. Traditionally, we've thought about philanthropy giving to faith institution, even workplace giving being very geographically defined. And now with technology changing, it really, gets to sort of those over on the left-hand side of the IAD, those factors that have widened the scope and might get to the point of people feeling unable to interact with larger global sorts of issues. So there is a consideration in the book about those exogenous sort of factors. But I think also one of our focus areas is on the technologies and how technologies have been really quickening the pace of how people interact in philanthropy and giving in a lot of ways, in ways that we can't foresee, with large language models. There's going to be a lot of questions about what that does for how people interact with what traditionally had been just their local communities and aren't anymore.
Yeah, good point, Brent. Yeah, Emily Barman distinguished between place-based and purpose-based. Yeah. There's some of the chapters are going to have some really interesting perspectives, I think, that can address that.
Do you want to add anything to Jess' question?
No, I think you're okay.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So then Gustavo. I just wanted to make sure.
So maybe there is a scholarship on this, and but I'm not an expert on this topic. So I was thinking about the role of wealth inequality. So just an idea to check how things evolve. So donations over time are growing, no? And donations as a share of GDP are growing. The fraction of people donating is going down. And that has a very simple explanation. Wealth inequality in the US has grown tremendously. I'm seeing here a St. Louis Fed, the standard tool that people use in econ for statistics. It's like share of total net worth held by top 1%. It was 23 at the beginning of the 90s. It's 30, around 30, 22. So now that gives you 7 points. So that will get you what? A lot of wealthy people interested in whatever, putting their money in several donations. And then I would say, if you're a regular citizen, let the Bill Gates of this world to finance things so they go out. So there is a lot of substitutions like that. So, and in part what we are seeing is mainly the consequence of wealth concentration in this period, okay? But again, that's probably too macro perspective, and there are a lot of micro things that you want to explore. But what I would like to see in a book like this is the micro connections. It's like, okay, you have this overall pattern, but who escaped from this pattern? Who was able to find a different path, a different solution, or to gain from this structural change, okay? Would be something interesting, kind of an approach of the book, or I am going on something that probably has been done, or it's not that interested in this area.
Yeah, the macro concerns that you just raised were exactly where we were coming from.
Okay.
Seeing these trends. And so that's exactly where we were. The micro is where we're hoping to get with the empirical chapters, in the sense that for this book, and I said, this is a new area of commons. So we're just at the beginning. So I really take your perspective here, and Jess's, and subscriptions and that very seriously. So I think with the micro, where we're focusing right now is having the, as you saw, people are using all the different tools and frameworks that the Bloomington School brings to bear. But focusing on, for this particular institutional arrangement, what does that mean? And so that feedback, as Brent said, on the left side of the IAD, is you're thinking about, how does this affect community, the community attributes of the community? If we change the technologies, if we change the rules, how do these affect that ask situation for this particular type of institutional arrangement? And then as Mike, the exchange with Mike, and he's got the next question, it was in terms of these are adjacent action situations that are happening, and that's what led us to feel donor fatigue. So I think that hopefully in the chapters, we're getting at some of the micro, but there's a lot of good research. The USA Giving, they have their survey. There's the PPI out of University of Michigan, where they followed the same 900 households over time. So we have some data sets that we can pull on to try to understand individual choices and bring those in. But the micro to macro is definitely, I'd like to chart it out intellectually. The different social dilemmas, the different levels of social dilemmas, and then the nested nature of the social dilemmas. I think that would, laying out that intellectually so that we can carve off parts of it as we build this. And then, of course, we're asking scholars to join us when they find something of interest that they want to research.
Going to be super quick follow-up. So something I think is interesting is that relating to the fatigue, maybe it's just that around 2015, the fraction of wealth going to the 1% stagnated. That growth stopped. So instead of fatigue, what you're observing is that this concentration of wealth on the top 1% stop at some point, and then it's not fatigue. It's essentially that you cannot keep using the same strategy of there's more super wealthy people that you can connect to new ways of donation. So it's that what give you the fatigue, or maybe not. So it's kind of more like a question, no?
Or the big fat fish is getting smaller.
That's exactly.
Or they've been going after the little fish that are like me renting.
Yes.
Rob, you know, they're trying to, they've got the, as Brent likes to say, they've got the, what is it, Brent? The wide net trawlers and the spear fishers and like, they're just getting every fish they can. In whatever way that they can do that. Brent always brings in the fish analogy. Mike has been,
Yeah, thanks. That's kind of an unusual follow-up. But anyway, thanks, Brenda, for the shout outs a couple of times. And despite the number of comments I had for you, you found something totally different to talk about today. So I'm impressed with that, if nothing else. I was really struck by your description of the willingness to give as sort of the foundational source of this commons. And I'd encourage you to pursue that idea a little bit further into what that would really mean. Because it's the willingness to give is inside our minds, right? And yet somehow that's generating this overall commons, there's overall potential resource base from which philanthropists could draw resources from that. And so you need to know a lot about what's going on in the people's minds in order to understand the dynamics of what would make that willingness more or less productive or more or less open. And just as you were talking about fish and stuff like that, I was reminded how I used to sit on committees with when Lynn was the chair and they were workshoppers were doing various students. And she'd say, you know, as we were putting together their program, well, you got to go over and take a course on hydrology if you're going to study water systems. And the student guy goes, or you got to study fishing systems. You know, you got to learn something about a fish. You know, and her point was basically, you got to know how the process behind the commons works. And so I'm presuming some of your colleagues here are really psychologists, social psychologists who are able to understand sort of what drives this willingness to give. And let me give you two observations that I'm sort of thinking of that I think are relevant there. There's a willingness to give sort of from, I don't know, evolution. Lynn used to often talk about how we're sort of evolutionarily evolved in order to work and play well with others. I mean, they also to take advantage of others, but there's this sociality that's kind of common, sort of an Adam Smith, David Hume kind of thing was sort of behind it. And I think, but a limit on that would be, or a complication on that is, if you're giving to some groups and then you get calls from other groups, you don't feel so bad about not giving because you're giving in that other way. So there's sort of the negative side that because of this willingness to give, people can tend to feel a little guilty when you have to, when you're asked again to give for some other reason. So it's not just a matter of time allocation or even money allocation. It's a more emotional kind of thing in that, you know, there's going to be emotion. And Lynn tried to incorporate that into her revised version of a utility function with her delta parameter, that people get positive or negative benefits from whether they're acting according to norms. And so when they don't give, when they say no to someone who's giving, you feel kind of bad about it. Sometimes you'll feel more bad about it if it's your minister saying it from the church. That's a little more difficult than random guy just called you on the phone. So that's why you got a lot of money go to the church sorts of stuff. So there's that, but then there's also the other aspect that I think, you know, the institutions can really play a big role here, in that you also don't want to be played for a sucker. So if you give money to somebody, you want them to make good use of it. Your example of the NRA is perfect. I mean, there's people kind of wondering whether, you know, it's really a good use of our money, no matter how much you like guns, to provide these, you know, yachts and benefits to these individuals that are running the place. And so there's, I think, an important aspect of information flow. I mean, what extent do givers get information about the quality of the money that they give to? I know I did some work on humanitarian aid, and there's like nonprofit sort of agencies that rate different organizations as to what proportion of their money do they spend on administration versus programs. And so that's sort of a mode of feedback. A lot of the humanitarian aid organizations have sponsorship programs or things like that. You get letters back from the student you're supposedly sponsoring, the student you're sponsoring in Africa or wherever. There's been some scandals arising from that where they're really kind of made up sort of connections and stuff like that. But that there's another way to sort of make it, to sort of strengthen the positive benefit one gets from giving is to make sure that make that giver more secure, more confident that their money's being used wisely. So there's these sort of conflicting sort of dynamics going on in there. And I just wonder how much you're building that in. And to take this commons logic that you know, Lynn really brought into political sciences, you really have to learn these policy areas in detail, even if it's biological, physical processes, you got to learn it because that's what the people are trying to, that's the source of their problems. And so you need to make sure you've got that covered. So I had to come up with something else other than what I had in my comments. So thanks for giving me something to work with.
Yeah, I look forward to our conversation. Yeah, I think you're spot on. And the kind of the strategy that we went with this book was to go to people who have deep expertise in these particular subjects and kind of bring them together with Bloomington School tools and thinking and see what happens. Substantively, I'd like to go off on that discussion about the charity ratings and the reliance on percent administrative costs, because I think that's why nonprofit people don't get paid enough. In some cases, not LaPierre. Brent, do you want to add to this? Or any of the
Yeah,
chapter
no.
authors?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that feedback loop, Mike, is really important. And maybe it gets back to that previous discussion about Emily Barman and sort of when you can give to a hurting group in southern Kenya now, just as easily as you could give to the local school district, it does attenuate sometimes the feedback loop. The other thing that we're talking about is sort of congestion. And I know Brenda said her original, dissertation was on congestion in toll goods. But I've been thinking about it in the sense of you get asked in a million different ways, whether you're at the register at the local Home Depot and they want you to add on 32 cents to your bill, or whether you buy a good, at Target that's good for the environment, or in a million different ways. And it sort of gets back to what you were saying. You sort of feel like, okay, I've done my deed and I don't need to do it anymore. And so one of the critiques of our book, and I hope somebody really fleshes it out, is that it's not so much that people are giving less, it's just people are giving in ways that we don't measure very well. And so patterns have just changed, and maybe we shouldn't be so anxious about this. Maybe it's just a normal process. Maybe that process is quickening, but maybe we should be okay with it.
I think that Renee Becker's chapter is really important for this point, because he's measuring, it's in the Dutch context, but he's measuring how declines and these are measured in various different questions. So your willingness to give is only one measure of pro-social behaviors. But he was able to find a connection, a correlation between decline in social values and declines in pro-social behaviors. And since affiliation with religion is declining, that was the commonality that a lot of people had, that had them tithing to their churches. And if they tithe to their church, they might be more, or their mosque or their temple, they might be more likely to give to other causes, right? And so one of the challenges I think that Renee Becker brings in this volume is that I think Sue Carter Call, who's on this call, is trying to say, how do we bring back these public values? Because we want to see this social behavior of your willingness to give. And kind of the connections, because I think the foundations for civil society here we're talking about. If we don't, as Lynn said, and I had the quote, I should have put it on the slide, the 2015 book, and she said, and we have to remember that civil society and an educated citizenry are the foundations of democracy. So I think that, you know, these are big questions and important questions in terms of, it could be like when Putnam came out with social capital, a lot of nonprofit scholars said, but wait a minute, we still have social capital. It's just, we're not in bowling lanes. It's moved on from the fraternal orders and we're doing it in different ways. So it's
Right.
not the case that social capital has gone down. It's just different. So maybe that's what's happening here. Maybe it's different, but at least I think in Renee Becker's work, multi-measures of social values and pro-social behaviors are going down. And they're correlated. I see Greg's got a question.
Yes. Also.
Hi there, and sorry I'm in the middle of making lunch, but this is really interesting. Good to see you all again. My favorite book to accompany Putnam's is actually Theda Skocpol's Diminished Democracy, which came immediately to my mind in hearing this, which I think makes an argument worth taking into account potentially to examine your assumption that the urge to give is simply a good. Skocpol's argument is basically that the classic American civil society of, you know, de Tocqueville and much of what we associate with, like, you know, when America was great, was actually, you know, participatory, large-scale membership organizations, and that the decline of the membership organizations where you could actually get an education in how to be a political creative agent, that decline is sort of not necessarily causal, but definitely intertwined with the rise of the nonprofit model, which is just like board staff and donors. And her case is like, we're not necessarily ever going to bring back the Shriners or the American Legion Hall, but it doesn't seem like the model of nonprofit charity is sort of replacing what was essentially a engine of democratic creativity and power. And I think I would just wonder, like, if we think that giving is good because of essentially a social or civic responsibility, I just wonder if it's a sense of civic responsibility that is the good. And I think the urge to give might actually be crowding out other kinds of civic responsibility urges. And the other thing, and I shared this in the chat, is that I don't think you can really tell the story of charity in terms of small donors. Average donors like you and Brett, right? Like, you might want to consider that to be maybe like a critical look would consider that to be window dressing on something else that is decidedly uncivic, which is the engine of philanthropy that essentially shapes civil society through major donations, which are different in kind than just like a person giving charitably. You know, you have major donors who are obviously not just purely good in their giving decisions. They're giving to things that potentially directly or indirectly increase their power and their personal stature. They get tax breaks, et cetera, et cetera. So I would just really encourage, maybe from a different angle, heed your colleagues' call to question this assumption about giving just being a pure good. Certainly, you know, I make decisions to give, and you know, I consider those to be good things, but it's much more complicated than that.
Greg, I couldn't agree more. So the motivation, our conversation, is the reason why I put that up. But in the slides on donor advised funds and the growth of donor advised funds, and then I love, you know, Gustavo's observation about the inequality in income. There are all different kinds of donors, and we have all different kinds of ways of giving. When we get to the the idea that giving is one of the measures of pro-social behaviors, there are multiple. And that the idea that pro-social behaviors are a good thing for civil society. Okay, so let's just start there. But then that the outcomes of what may happen for those donations may not be feeding back in to the dimensions of the attributes of the community that would build more social value and grow social behaviors. There are, you know, we talked about this in terms of donor advised funds, where you're wealthy, you're getting a tax break, you dump it in the donor advised funds, and Fidelity Charity just gets to decide where to give it. So you're really separated from whatever charitable target population you want it to reach. So I'm not going to take on the whole argument about the nonprofit, that sector, because it's too big to do it right now. But I'd love to continue conversations on this. Brent, do you want to get the last word?
No, thank you, Brenda.
Thanks for sitting, even though you're in pain.
Thanks again, Brenda, for the presentation, and we can continue the conversation with lunch, over lunch.
All on Zoom. Email me your thoughts. That would be great.
Yeah, it's hard. Some of them are really long, I'm like, I'm not reading that.
I don't know who the
Yeah, so I used to actually.
I don't know who the old.
Oh, Doc.
I saw.
Oh.
So I
I know, you
You know the question, because I was thinking Zoom.
I was thinking about hardcore.
I see. I saw your picture. I think.
You know, it's.
Saw your picture
Yeah.
on the
You mitigate also.
poster. It's
That's what I'm thinking about.
sincerely.
Yeah. And I kind of.
Protective order of.
So my, macro, micro thing like really interesting.
Yeah.
If I see this, it's
Now,
maybe 1% is too low.
I imagine just being a person research to come out of it.
It's going to be even more.
Would be it's about like how.
Huge rise.
Benefits.